Aphorism 208. When a philosopher today gives us to understand that he is not a skeptic, I hope the foregoing account of the objective spirit has brought this one out. All the world is offended to hear it. Hereafter he is regarded with a certain dread. There is so much one would like to ask him. Indeed, among timid listeners, of whom there are nowadays a very great number, he is henceforth considered dangerous. It is as if, in his rejection of skepticism, it seemed to hear some evil, menacing sound from afar, as if some new explosive were being tested somewhere, a dynamite of the spirit, perhaps a newly discovered Russian nail, a pessimism bonne volontaise, which does not merely say no, will no, but dreadful thought does the no. Against this kind of good will, a will to the actual active denial of life, there is today, confessedly, no better sedative and soporific than skepticism. The gentle, gracious, lulling poppy skepticism, and even Hamlet is prescribed by the doctors of our time against the spirit, and its noises under the ground. Are our ears not already filled with nasty noises? Says the skeptic, as a friend of sleep, and almost as a kind of security police. This subterranean no is terrible. Be quiet, you pessimistic noises. For the skeptic, that delicate creature is all too easily frightened. His conscience is schooled to wince at every no, indeed, even at a hard decisive yes, and to a sense something like a sting. Yes and no. That is to him contrary to morality. On the other hand, he likes his virtue to enjoy a noble countenance. Perhaps by saying after Montaigne, "What do I know?" Or after Socrates, "I know that I know nothing." Or, "Here I do not trust myself. Here no door stands open to me." Or, "If I didn't stand open, why go through it?" Or, "Why is the point of hasty hypotheses? To make no hypothesis at all could well be a part of good taste. Do you absolutely have to go straightening out what is crooked, absolutely have to stop up every hole with oak? Is there not plenty of time? Does time not have time? Oh, you rogues, are you unable to wait? Uncertainty, too, has its charms. The Sphinx is to a Cicero. Cicero, too, was a philosopher. Thus does a skeptic console himself, and it is true he stands in need of some consolation. For skepticism is the most spiritual expression of a certain complex physiological condition, called, in ordinary language, nervous debility and sickliness. It arises whenever races or classes, long separated from one another, are decisively and suddenly crossed. In the next generation, which has, as it were, inherited varying standards and values in its blood, all is unrest, disordered, doubt, experiment, the most vital forces with a retarding effect. The virtues themselves will not let one another grow and become strong, equilibrium, center of balance, upright certainty are lacking in body and soul. But that which becomes more profoundly sick and degenerates in such hybrids is the will. They no longer have any conception of independence, of decision, of the valiant feeling of pleasure in willing. Even in their dreams they doubt the freedom of the will. Our Europe of today, the scene of a seamlessly sudden attempt at radical class, and consequently race, mixture, is a result skeptical from top to bottom, now with the angle skepticism which springs impatiently and greedily from branch to branch, now gloomingly, like a cloud overcharged with question marks, and often sick to death of its will, paralysis of will. Where does not one find this cripple sitting today, and frequently, so dressed up, how seductively dressed up? There is the loveliest false finery available for this disease, that most of that which appears in the shop windows today as objectivity, scientificality, l'art pur et l'art, pure will-less knowledge, is merely skepticism and will paralysis dressed up. For this diagnosis of the European sickness, I am willing to go bail. Sickness of will is distributed over Europe unequally. It appears most virulently and abundantly where culture has been longest indigenous. It declines according to the next extent to which the barbarian still, or again, asserts his rights under the loose-fitting garment of Western culture. In present-day France, consequently, as one can as easily deduce as actually see, the will is sick. In France, which has always possessed a masterly adroitness in transforming even the most fateful cries of its spirit into something charming and seductive, today really demonstrates its cultural ancestry over Europe as the school and showcase for all the fascinations of skepticism. The strength to will and to will one thing for a long time is somewhat stronger already in Germany, and stronger again in the north of Germany, when in the center of Germany, considerably stronger in England, Spain, and Corsica. There is association with dullness, here with hardness of head, not to speak of Italy, which is too young to know what it wants and first has to prove whether it is capable of willing, but strongest of all and most astonishing in that huge empire in between, where Europe as it were flows back into Asia and Russia. There, the strength of the will has for long been stored up and kept in reserve. There, the will is waiting, menacingly, uncertain whether it is a will to deny or a will to affirm, in readiness to discharge itself. To borrow one of the physicist's favorite words, it may need not only wars in India and Asian involvements to relieve Europe of the greatest danger facing it, but also internal eruptions, the explosion of the empire into small fragments, and above all the introduction of the parliamentary imbecility, including the obligation upon everyone to read his new newspaper at breakfast. I do not say this because I desire it. The reserve would be more after my thought. I need such an increase in the Russian threat that Europe would have to resolve to become equally threatening, namely, to acquire a single will by means of a new chase dominating all Europe, a protracted terrible will of its own which could set its objectives thousands of years ahead, so that long drawn out comedy of its petty states and the divided will of its dynasties and democracies would finally come to an end. The time for petty politics is past. The very next century will belong to the struggling for mastery over the whole earth, the compulsion to grand politics. Welcome to the new episode of Dragon Ball Z. Previously, Nietzsche approached the objective man. And the objective man, with his indecisive, unambiguous, and most succinctly feminine tone, couldn't overcome Nietzsche, for Nietzsche gazed immensely and perilously into the eyes of this objective man, till he cornered himself. Now, Nietzsche arrives at the political condition of this objective spirit on a geopolitical scale. He simply begins that the philosopher of today, as we are presented forward with it, understands that he is no skeptic. And that Nietzsche would say, oh, I hope that this foregoing account of this philosopher or objective spirit is that you're being brought out or discharged or elicited out. But the entire world, is provoked from hearing this philosopher. While at the same time, this philosopher is experiencing some inner dread from being heard. I'd rename the philosopher in this sense the scholar or the free spirit, but in this context, we'll continue to use the philosopher. There is, quote, there is so much one would like to ask him, indeed, among the timid listeners, of whom there are nowadays a very great number, while at the same time call him dangerous. The same rendezvous message that he said 2 to 3 aphorisms ago, where this scholar or philosopher, extraordinary, and to a degree, a higher individual physiologically and mentally, till he succumbed to the commonality of people. Now he's being again labeled as dangerous. Quote, it is as if in his rejection of skepticism they seemed to hear some evil, something menacing. And this new explosive, as if we were being tested somewhere, a dynamite of the spirit, perhaps a newly discovered Russian nihili or nihilism, a pessimism of bonne volentantes, Latin for goodwill, a pessimism of the goodwill, which does not merely say no, or will no, but, oh, the dreadful thought, Nietzsche says, does this no? What Nietzsche's arriving at is, whilst in public, this individual, or the philosopher, he simply denies skepticism, but because of how the collective crowd functions, to a degree. Not the collective crowd, but he's sensing among this, because the collective crowd, they're idiotic, imbecilic, and blind to what the philosopher is saying. But at first they're contrarian. What Nietzsche's highlighting is he hears an evil, a menacing noise from afar, this explosive Russian nihilism, and pessimistic goodwill, where it doesn't say no, or will the no, but simply acts upon this no. What no is he describing in this sense? This no is describing something that's mindless, inauthentic, repressive, abstinent. It's a life-denying no. Not the lion that he describes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra with the 3 metamorphoses. But that lion was presenting the stage for individual self-creation and independence, while at the same time couldn't establish value. Quote, this kind of good will, a will to the actual active denial of life, there is today confessedly no better sedative and soporific than skepticism. The gentle, gracious, lulling puppy skepticism. Even Hamlet is ascribed or prescribed by the doctors of our time against the spirit and its noises under the ground. Hamlet. The notorious, the illustrious quote, to be or not to be. That is the question. Including Hamlet himself is embodying this skepticism. And now this life-denying, soporific, and sedative skepticism is transforming to off-breeds of nihilism and pessimistic goodwill. That's a criticism to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Quote, our aren't our ears not already filled with nasty noises? Says the skeptic. Says the skeptic of sleep. But now, this kind of security police of the skeptic says, this subterranean no is terrible. Be quiet, you pessimistic moles. For the skeptic, that delicate creature is all too easily frightened. His conscience is schooled to wince at every no, and indeed even at a hard, decisive yes, and to sense something like a sting. One skeptic is tranquilizing or using lull tactics to sedate noises. These noises he's describing is truth. There's a great quote of him where to determine a man's strength is how he tolerates truth. If he nullifies, sweetens, ignores, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. Never mind, I'm not sneezing. So there's the sneeze boiling inside my nostrils. This is a partial deviation. Sneezing is a nuance. Out to Nietzsche again. To determine a man's strength is how he tolerates the degree of truth that he nullifies, sweetens, ignores, hinders, or deludes the texture of truth. And this is he's describing as that skeptic of sleep. With the skeptic security police, who participates as the gendarme or the policeman, and says, "Oh, this no is terrible. Don't you do this to these people," while at the same time participating in that life denying no. Quote, the yes and the no, that is to him contrary to morality. On the other hand, he likes his virtue to enjoy a noble countenance and conscience, perhaps by saying after Michel de Montaigne, a Renaissance philosopher, "What do I know?" Or to quote Socrates, "I know that I know nothing." Or, here I do not trust myself. Here no door stands open to me." Or, if it did not stand open, why go in? Or, what is the point of hasty hypothesis? To make no hypotheses at all could will be a part of good taste. Do you absolutely have to go straighten out what is crooked? Absolutely have to stop up every hole with oak? Is there no plenty of time? Does time not have time? Oh, you rogues, you are unable to wait. Uncertainty has its charms. The Sphinx too is a Cicero. Cicero too is a philosopher. Nietzsche would describe the skeptic of of overindulging and consoling or calming and having this form of consolation through these compulsive and convalescing thoughts of, "Oh, if I don't know it, then I don't know it. I'm skeptic of myself. I'm not knowing this." Him too is criticizing Descartes. "I think, therefore I am." Because thinking is a primary, whilst the instincts is a secondary. Nietzsche would reverse and say, "I am, therefore I think." I, me, position myself forward so that the instincts, the body, and the self becomes primary, and that the spirit and ego, or in this sense, to a degree, monitored pride becomes a secondary. Or the spirit. Spirit in this sense can be translated from the German word Geist to mind or spirit. So in this situation, when we're discussing objective spirit, he's saying objective minds. In reality, from what we've previously said of Nietzsche, it's it's psychological prejudice through physiological perception of reality. AKA, when they see something in the world, they're like, I don't like it. I don't like it. I'm gonna be judgmental of it. I'm gonna go about my day being ignorant. But isn't ignorant bliss? Yes, it is. Thus does a skeptic console himself. And it is true he stands in need of some consolation. Quotes. For skepticism is the most spiritual expression of a certain complex physiological condition called, in ordinary language, of dread, sickness, and debility. Justifies what I've said earlier. It arises whenever races or classes, long separate from one another, are decisively and suddenly crossed. Now, he's altering from a individual scale to now a social scale, including the classes, including the ethnicities or the race. And once individuals that are separated for a brief time are cohesive, they become decisively and shrewdly puzzled with one another. Quote, he's including nations too. This new and next generation have inherited varying standards and values in its blood. All its unrest, disorder, doubt, and experiment. The most vital forces have a retarding effect. The virtues themselves still will not let one another grow and become strong. Equilibrium, center of balance, upright certainty are lacking inside the body and the soul. The soul, to be translate in Nietzschean terms, is joy, passion, and exuberance. That's what the soul is to Nietzsche. And if you've heard the term noble soul, you could translate it to a noble, joyous, passionate, and exuberant person. And we've defined previously what Nietzsche thinks is noble. In this sense, as we described, once these nations, to simply say he's criticizing nationalism and uniformity in not a secular society, where these varying standards or customs and values that are embedded in this nationalistic blood have become off balance. There's a lacking of strength, equilibrium, or as he would say, a lacking of upright certainty of the body and soul because of this varying and prejudiced separation of the two for millennia to say. And now they have crossed paths. Quote, but with this becomes profoundly sick and degenerates to such hybrids inside the will. Or this hybrid is the will. Here's Nietzsche's screwball pitch, where people would think, oh, the will to power, it's inside of the humans. Now, he's describing not solely the will to power, but the will itself. I said the will to power instinctually as people conceive it as an independent unit inside people. No, it has its functions, solely the will too. It has a multiplicity of itself. And now he's describing that this sick and degenerate hybrid is the will, but on a collective scale. It's still the will, but degenerated and suffocating. Whew, these burps. No longer any conception of independence of decision, valiant feeling of pleasure in willing. Even in their dreams, they doubt the freedom of the will. Freedom of will is the first early states or events of liberating oneself from the collection of objective and societal concepts. And he recognizes this on a collective societal scale, where these sacerdotal or pessimistic and nihilistic people promote goodwill, while at the same time, with the with this advertising of goodwill, they recognize other individuals who think outside their nation and think, oh, these people don't have good wills. We must kill them. We must take over them. We must teach them what goodwill is, because we possess it. And from this, the conception of freedom of will and independence and the valiant pleasure of willing, or the participation of the instincts in action, is degraded. Quote, our Europe of today, the scene of a sudden attempt of radical class, and consequently race, have mixed. And the result from this is that skepticism begins from top to bottom. Now with this angular or angled skepticism, which brings impatience and greed from branch to branch. Now this cloud of gloom looms and overcharged with question marks. It wants the sick to death of its will. It's this paralysis of the will. Think of what he was expressing earlier in part 5, the religious nature, where morality, the convulsions of the inner convulsions of objective morality, was a paralysis, a suicidal reason, and a epilepsy of the body because of its reactive pulse to these morals. This is what he's seeing today, and this is where his skepticism, not skepticism, his sarcasm enters. He says, where does not one find this cripple sitting today? People say this is not a sarcasm. It's a sarcasm, but with some truth inside. Have you heard that artists paint lies whilst showing the truth? They can't verbally say it, thus they paint it, and it appears as a lie, but there's inner truths. And this is him being an artist who's lying in front of you, but at the same time being true. And frequently, it loves to dress up. It's seductively dressed up. There is this loveliest false finery of this disease. The most of it appears in the shop windows today as objectivity, scientificality. L'art pour l'art. French translation of art for art's sake. Pure will-less knowledge is merely skepticism, and will paralysis is dressed up. For this diagnosis of the European sickness, I am willing to go bail. What he's describing here is what he's previously described in other chapters and inside this aphorism. He's ridiculed Rousseau, the skeptics, Descartes, to a degree, Michel de Montaigne, albeit he loved Montaigne. He loved his progress, but this is the one critique he had of him. Plus, he he had this desire to mimic his Renaissance and elegant style of writing, before realizing that, oh, I have my own version of Montaigne, aka me, Nietzsche. and criticizing Socrates once again, and Descartes, if I didn't say. Sickness of the will is distributed over Europe unequally. It appears most virulently and abundantly where culture has been longest. Indigenous is indigenous is in its decline according to the extent of the barbarian. Or again, asserts, excuse me, I'm moving myself to move the camera because my legs are in agony. Or asserts his rights under the loose-fitting garment of Western culture. In present-day France, one can easily deduce, as actually see, the will is sick. And France, which has always possessed a masterly adroitness, dexterity, or proficient in craftsmanship, and outside of craftsmanship is excellent. So he's criticizing this mastered adroitness inside France because of what we described earlier. But with France, it demonstrated that resentment or sickness on a political scale with the French Revolution, and again with the 1848 revolutions. This transformation in the most fateful cries of its spirit into something charming and seductive. Today, it really demonstrates the culture ascendancy and ancestry over Europe as the school and showship for all the fascinations. It includes at the same time the Enlightenment, where they were dependent on science, abstract thought, reason, seriousness, discipline, and vigor to denounce godly beings, whilst not thinking of using evidence to show the existence of godly being. The strength of will, or to will one thing for a long time, is somewhat stronger already in Germany. Romanticism, which transformed to nationalism, is again stronger again in the north of Germany, the unification of northern Germany before southern, then in the center of Germany, considerably stronger, excuse me again, in England, Spain, and Corsica. There is no associate excuse me. They're in association with dullness. Here with hardness of head, not to speak of Italy, which is too young to know what it wants, and first has to prove whether it is capable of willing. What he's arriving at is what he's arriving at is the nationalistic politics that were involved in after the 1848 revolution, say in Germany, Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, England, and with the entire continent of Europe, including Russia. And he was criticized Russia earlier with its Russian nationalism and nihilism. He involved Russia as the continental opponent of Europe and of Asia, linking the two continents to one another. Whilst at the same time, he was speaking of newspapers. To quote him on newspapers. He said that Europe of the greatest danger facing it, but also internal revolutions and eruptions. This explosion of the entire empire into small fragments, and above all the introduction of parliamentary imbecility, including the obligation upon everyone to read a newspaper at breakfast. Be caught up with the news, see what's happening. Why is there explosives happening both internally and externally? And then he adds the consoling and equanimous effect of prevailing and winning in Asia to alleviate pressure off of them till Russia explodes herself again, say in Crimea, with the Sevastopol port in Crimea, conquering the Black Sea, and modern day Turkmenistan, which is Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and other and Tajikistan, other Stan nations, including Azerbaijan, aka the Middle East, but not Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is what Germany is of the Cold War, but in 18th century, no, 19th century Europe and minor Asia, there was a first Cold War named the Great War. It was Great Britain versus the Russian Empire. They were seizing colonization on Afghanistan. If you remember the Cold War, it was communism versus capitalism to seize the uh, German nation. Whilst at the same time, when he's expressing of these internal and external explosions to collapse, and this is great foresight too, to collapse empires to miniature fragments, whilst at the same time it introduces another form of parliamentary imbecility. He's staring at you, the Russian Empire, or yes, this Russian Empire that resolves in a revolution and civil war. Whilst he has this foresight in the beyond his time and beyond our time for the compulsion of grand politics. Nietzsche's grand politics. On a collective will, on a collective dictatorship that where individuals are independent and strong of one another, but once they're collective, they allocate this dictatorship of independence, will, freedom, strength, with if I didn't say wisdom, and etc. etc. There's a link in the description of the Men's Academy. I'm Gregory. Amor Fati. Love for fate.